Gotta ask you the big question, one everyone wonders about. What happens after death?
You wish me to tell you if the human belief in the gods is well-founded? Well, that I do not know. We vampires differ exceedingly from you humans. Our matter, that of which we are composed, can exist without form. We require neither a heart, nor a brain, nor air to breathe.
But were you dead?
As humans understand death, yes. Indeed, it's hard to compare to anything I know. Yet you are aware we don't see death as you do. The way you cling to life, we find it entirely peculiar. You are mortals, ergo it's a foregone conclusion. You will die. It's but a question of time. Thus, I often find myself wondering why you try so very hard. To die at 20 years, 40, even 100, what's the difference? They're all but the blink of an eye.
Depends on your point of view. Man who's got 1,000,000 crowns to spend can't possibly understand one who's only got 20.
Very true. One's outlook can indeed change much.
The Witcher 3's Blood and Wine expansion served as a final hurrah and goodbye to CD Projekt Red's work on Geralt's journey. But while one may have assumed that this send-off would be a callback to the familiar, perhaps a murky and bleak journey through a land reminiscent of Velen or Flotsam, this story is entirely unique relative to the rest of the series. And unlike the wonderful Hearts of Stone, which only added a little bit of depth to the already established world map, Blood and Wine takes place in an entirely new region, the 5th in the game and arguably the most gorgeous. This expansion is stylistically a natural extension of the storytelling transition from Witcher 3 proper into Hearts of Stone. Whereas the main game is very gritty, organic, and self-referential in style, very much being the ultimate Witcher story, Hearts of Stone maintained that, and added an increased focus on folklore, as I discussed in my video on it. Blood and Wine radicalized that further, being a story very much in the vein of a classic Greek tragedy and taking inspiration from fairy tales in order to be the most topsy-turvy in terms of tone, swinging from dark to light quite rapidly or intermingling both in certain situations. It uses this more classical framework to distinguish itself, aesthetically and structurally, but it never loses that sense of Witcher identity, and those very dark, very ominous themes are present throughout the plot, characters, and setting. Blood and Wine takes place in the rich land of Toussaint, a gorgeous landscape of fantastical, picturesque towers, vast plains, beautiful sunsets, and cozy taverns and vineyards. And it is beautifully realized in terms of integrative storytelling, immersion, organic indirect world building, and little details in classic Witcher fashion. As pointed out in Lorerunner's video on the expansion, as you travel from the densely populated regions of Toussaint to the Royal Palace, the class shift is obvious as the layout of the town transitions. The architecture gets more traditionally grand, the population grows sparser, the place gets quieter, and the amount of empty space increases as you go to demonstrate the wealth and luxury of royalty in this land. But even aside from these visual and atmospheric details, Toussaint is dripping in authenticity and culture. From the aristocratic, postured political dialogue and standing on ceremony from the high officials in this land, to the tiny tidbits. How wine can be used to track people forensically, how Anna Rieta remarks that a grim, bloody story such as the killing spree taking place does wonder for the mystique and reputation of a vineyard, how the histories of each wine are chronicled in books. The more tidbits, the more Toussaint props itself up as a fleshed out and brilliantly substantial video game setting. It's everywhere. But aside from the technical brilliance, Blood and Wine uses Toussaint as a way to present a lot of the primary ideas of the story. It is rendered in a completely different color palette from the rest of the game, far removed from the murky browns and blacks of a lot of the mainland, and far bolder than the subtler grays, greens, and blues of Skellige, and this vibrant color theme reveals quite a bit about the type of place this is. A small duchy under the banner of Nilfgaard, Toussaint is a land of the rich and aristocratic, but one whose economy isn't as unstable and top-heavy as that of Novigrad. There is the occasional person you come across living in poverty, as this is The Witcher after all, but the vast majority can find a place for themselves in Toussaint, with the poorest tending to the fields or acting as butlers or servants, yet still being able to find a roof over their heads, an occasional glass of wine, and a life to look forward to. Whether it be in the royal capital of Beauclair, the lush greenery surrounding it, or the scattered settlements, Toussaint is something of a vacation from the negatives of the other regions. Not swampy and suffering from famine like Velen, not corrupt like Novigrad, not swarmed by Redanians and underlying anxiety like Oxenfurt, and not brutally cutthroat like Skellige. And this last point is one of the prevailing traits of Toussaint, the crux of one of the major themes of this story.
Most honorable Geralt, slayer of monsters and all evils nefarious, which prey on the defenseless of this world. Whereas never have you been known to deny help to the innocent, nor leave widows and orphans to fates undeserved. Answer you now our present summons. Free us from the beast which floods our streets with blood, and sows panic in the hearts of rich and poor alike. Come to our aid, Witcher. Thus humbly beseeches you the star-crossed city's most gracious protectress, Her Illustrious Highness, Duchess Anna Henrietta.
Shall you answer her call?
Anna Henrietta really say all that? Word for word?
In point of fact, she said, "Bring me the Witcher and dare not spare your horses. Only make certain this time he comes alone." The Ducal Chamberlain added the rest. You know how it is.
Yeah, I remember.
Toussaint is allowed to be fairly independent and autonomous in terms of government and politics despite being a vassal state of Nilfgaard, which makes this expansion one that forsakes the grander political climate that we have become used to within the Witcher universe, and makes the politics in this story much more personal and smaller scale in comparison. Geralt's journey to Toussaint is one of necessity, a quest to defeat an all-powerful higher vampire, the likes of which he has never seen before. He is called as a request from royalty, but even despite their plea, it becomes obvious that Toussaint is a place tragically out of its depth and totally incapable of dealing with a threat like this. It's a land of pretty words, immaterial gestures, and extreme idealism, and they, as a whole, have no idea just what they're up against. They do not have a truly organized military, but a scattered collection of guards and knights errant, desperate for romantic glory and oblivious to the truth of the genuine horrors that lurk in this world. Simply put, Toussaint is naive. There is an unseasoned beauty to the place. It has its fair share of monsters, but it is far less of a problem here than in any other region in Witcher 3. And naturally, for a story as absorbed in the subtleties as this one, this is reflected through the personality of Toussaint's people and how society functions as well. This much is immediately displayed in the literal first few minutes of the expansion, as the knights sent as an envoy to hire Geralt show their obliviousness by trying to settle a dispute in a village with some bandits by attempting to appeal to them with words. This results in a house fire. And when the bandits insult the name of the knight's duchess, they consider it an affront that cannot be forgiven, forego their hopes for a peaceful resolution, and slaughter all of them in the village square. They leave the small hamlet a smoldering ruin full of bloody corpses, and wonder why the townsfolk are scared out of their wits and not thankful for what they did.
Why do they not emerge? It is over. We have banished the scoundrels, lifted oppression's yoke from their lives.
Warned you it'd be like this. Fear you as much as they did the bandits now. Sorry, no fanfares and flowers. You're not in Toussaint.
This is an encapsulation of Toussaint's views on dealing with conflict, with an extreme focus on naive romanticism, redundant honor, and a lack of perspective. And this isolated sequence proved to be a preview of how the region operates on the whole, and how this tunnel vision would blind them. Geralt accepts his summons to help with the higher vampire that's ravaging Toussaint, a deadly foe to say the least. So he travels to the land of love and wine, and is immediately confronted with the sad fact that these people are in way over their heads. Guillaume trying to take on a giant on his own for the honor of a woman he loves, Damien de la Tour insisting that he simply doesn't believe that this task is too big to be handled without help, those in power humiliating and caging wild beasts for sport despite the sheer danger at play in these ceremonies. It is clear to Geralt and the audience from the beginning that these people are not serious, not really, and they are ignorant of how close to true peril they are.
You should know I spoke against summoning you here. I've heard much about you. You bring trouble, or thus far have, always. And we've enough trouble as it is. Yet we are capable of defeating the beast on our own, without an outsider's help. I've no doubt about it.
Those inhabiting Toussaint are overly romantic, fixated on achieving glory or fleeting fancies, but unaware of the harsher realities of the world. And in this case, ideals and behaviors from a societal perspective trickle down from the top to the bottom, and this is portrayed most succinctly through Anna Henrietta and those immediately serving her showing the worst of this naivete. The powers that be chastise Geralt for not dealing with the monster quickly, despite the fact that it's a bloody hire vampire, and one of the most dangerous beasts known to man, and they offer some advice on how to fight it. Surely, all you need to do is draw him into sunlight and ward him off with garlic, right? You can't help but shake your head at this, but at the same time, it's hard to entirely blame these people. It is how their environments have stimulated them to live. Just as famine in Velen and corruption in Novigrad caused the most astute people in those places to act with brutal pragmatism, Toussaint encourages luxury and ideals. These people are rarely ever exposed to the terrors of the world, and this lack of exposure causes them to be lax. It's only natural. And the beautiful landscapes of Toussaint reflect that luxury. However, now that they are faced with such a devastating foe, it's up to Geralt to bring the lessons that he's learned with him and wake them up from their stupor. This sets the stage for an important thematic message in Blood and Wine's story, one about the dismissal of romantic ideals and honor. Having traveled with Geralt for countless hours, we know of the realities of this setting. But recontextualizing it in a society where people are so hopelessly blinded is a unique reminder to drive home this familiar message once again. And when these people are struck with the realization of the truth, they are immediately and acutely slapped in the face with the fact that they were living in a bubble. This slowly gets proven to them with the murders of the Knights Errant, but primarily in the end when Beauclair is attacked in the Night of the Long Fangs. A battle which no one in Toussaint was ready for.
Need to withdraw, you and your men, now.
My duty lies with the city.
Won't help this city by leading your men to the slaughter. Damien, conversation back at the palace, remember? I'll say it again. Your men don't stand a chance.
But this lack of experience was not the only primary contributor to Toussaint's struggles in this story. In fact, there are deeply rooted cultural aspects of Toussaint that have been preserved for generations that, while not inherently detrimental in and of themselves, are precursors to these sorts of tragedies in certain unfortunate contexts, ones that also have foundations in this familiar naivete.
In Toussaint, we believe men of low birth should be simple-hearted and obedient. We expect much more, however, of our knights. They are to be soldiers and courtiers, lords and servants. Thus, the need for clear moral guidelines. At the time of his dubbing, a knight vows to demonstrate throughout his life honor, wisdom, generosity, valor, and compassion.
As Duchess Anna Henrietta says here, Toussaint pays special attention to bloodlines and status, and the situations in which people are born into are of utmost importance. Those of simple birth are not expected to do anything special, but those born into families of esteem are expected to be honorable and courteous, expected to grow into a profession of status. It's a subtle little detail that's just touched upon by the Duchess, and it adds a little bit of depth and detail to the setting. Yet it also lends insight into Henrietta's situation and her dynamics with her sister, which we'll discuss in a bit, as it introduces two themes. With blood and status being of utmost importance here, there are some important precedents set. Firstly, those who are born into a situation and environment are restricted to playing a role within set expectations. Like I said, those born into noble houses are expected to become great knights or individuals of great status and nobility. Those of low birth are not mistreated by any means, but really aren't given the time of day comparatively. And if someone were to be hypothetically born under a bad sign or perceived to be cursed for arbitrary reasons, things would be difficult for them in a setting with this sort of focus. It isn't quite nepotism, and it isn't meritocracy. It's a bit of both. People in Toussaint have things expected of them from birth, and they are nudged in that direction by their environment. It isn't impossible for someone of low birth to rise up into a grand role, but it is challenging, and they face an uphill battle to do so. And as demonstrated through the story, the stricter the imposed limitations on someone, the less likely they will be able to escape those shackles. The second theme brought up by this element of the setting is the following. Blood is important. It has greater significance in Toussaint than in any other place in the setting due to this emphasis, which means that bloodlines are no doubt a higher priority here. An inhabitant of Toussaint would be more likely to trust a family member than a friend due to this blood connection, and in extreme cases, this could lead to skewed judgment. And this aspect has implications throughout the story. Deep into the plot, it is revealed that the higher vampire responsible for these murders, Detlef, was deceived and betrayed by the woman he loved in order to be a tool to carry out her vengeance. This woman's name was Syanna, who turned out to be the sister of Henrietta. Having been apparently born under a bad sign, the curse of the Black Sun, Syanna was shunned by the vast majority around her, including her parents, as her childhood went on. The only one who seemed to truly love and understand her was her sister. Syanna was eventually banished from Beauclair and her family as a teenager, and she was abused and severely mistreated by the royal knights tasked with her exile. She was able to survive, but grew up festering a hatred for those who wronged her. The murders throughout the game orchestrated by Syanna and carried out by Detlef are her way of exacting revenge on those knights, and her intended murder of Henrietta was her way of punishing her sister for forgetting about her. She indirectly leads to the destruction of Beauclair in the Night of the Long Fangs, the death of Detlef, and a ton of bloodshed along the way. However, despite the severity of these terrible deeds, Anna Henrietta consistently refuses to properly try Syanna for her crimes and make her face justice, simply because she's her sister.
You have committed crimes. Grave crimes. Yet you are my sister, and my heart does not allow me to treat you as a common criminal.
This is a result of the region's short-sighted obliviousness. This blind emphasis on blood defies logic, and yet the Duchess adheres to it anyway due to both it and her love for her sister. And this leads to a radical outcome in one of the endings, which further reinforces all of this. I think that the story that Blood and Wine is intending to tell is one of a razor focus on perspective. I think that from a certain angle, this is a story with no monolithic villain or villains, just victims of circumstance. Obviously, some characters react differently and worse than others due to their circumstances, and this is reflected in their deeds and speaks of their character, so the game doesn't avoid blaming these people, but there isn't a single character in this expansion that I can think of whose wrongdoings don't have at least one layer of depth or moral ambiguity to them. Blood and Wine consistently challenges the player to see things from all of these characters' points of views before making snap judgments of anyone, good or bad, because a lot of these cases are various shades of gray. And there is no shortage of examples to choose from. Even in minor instances, such as the one with the Shaelmar, labeled a beast but lashing out as a victim of cruel captivity. Those in Toussaint, who, as I discussed, are bred to act in a somewhat naive and oblivious way, but who can't be entirely blamed because they have not been stimulated to be more open-minded. The Spotted White, entirely peaceful and just wanting someone to help her, despite how appearances deceived. Guillaume, who seemed to be a hopelessly romantic fool in over his head, but proved to be someone who actually backed his words up with actions and wholehearted conviction. The man who seems to be a doofus who's actually collecting photos for his bedridden, comatose daughter. Vampires in general, who do terrible things but primarily as a result of their nature. In a somewhat different and more extreme case, the higher vampire, who is of such elite status and power in his realm that he sees the countless deaths of humans as no different than the slaughter of livestock. And hell knows Oriana's mutually beneficial agreement with the homeless kids is a situation that would make anyone question perspective. Regis in particular is an admirable example of this. He is a higher vampire as well, but he trained himself to fight against his nature and not give in to the impulses that vampires are plagued with while in the world of humans. To be clear, drinking blood is not a necessity for higher vampires, but it is similar to drugs or alcohol, and close proximity to humans and blood can cause extreme temptation. Yet Regis constantly resists, especially so in the case of the situation where Geralt had to tempt him in order to procure frenzied higher vampire blood. This resistance is excruciatingly difficult, but Regis manages to not be a bloodthirsty killer or a man of violence, despite him being biologically engineered to need to do so, and despite the fact that this is often like withdrawal, with urges growing more powerful over time. It's something that I think is truly amazing about Regis, and very few throughout the game seem to acknowledge how impressive and good of a man he is for this. And then there is obviously Syanna, marked since birth as a cursed child, though significantly, the game makes sure to be vague and unclear as to whether or not the Curse of the Black Sun actually existed. With the universe of The Witcher being a fantasy setting where curses are very relevant, it is definitely possible that the curse could have been a real thing. However, it is never confirmed, and if it wasn't a real thing, then Syanna was treated the way she was for no reason, and likely became as hated and disturbed as she was due to how people acted towards her in response to something that never existed.
What did your sister do to get banished?
Syanna was cursed.
Parents run afoul of some mage?
No. She was born at an inopportune moment. They said she was touched by the curse of the Black Sun. Geralt, is it true? Can an individual be evil because they were born during the wrong lunar phase?
Could be the case. Could also be because they were treated like lepers from birth. Isolated, prodded, ostracized. Couldn't have had it easy, Syanna.
She was angry at the whole world.
Regardless of whether the curse was real or not, Syanna was unfairly shunned, abused, and chastised for reasons out of her control, and it is clear that a life of nurturing and love would have given her a far happier end, and caused much less suffering later on. But this suffering keys us into what the politics and military of the powers in Toussaint are truly like behind the vows and words, another way of championing perspective, through showing us the darkness behind the seemingly good, instead of the shades of grey behind the horrible deeds this time. The Bruxa shoving coins down the throats of the knights errant's corpses is a blunt way of critiquing the shallow ideals and redundancy of the fancy words and notions of honor that permeate Toussaint's armed forces. The chivalric virtues of honor, wisdom, generosity, valor, and compassion have gone to rot, and the knights who swear vows to these say all the right things but do not follow through with their actions and are instead motivated by personal gain and satisfaction, often leading to cruelty. Syanna is punishing them for their deception and hypocrisy. Partly through her, we come to learn that Toussaint as a whole hides behind these ideals of honor and chivalry, whether they know it or not. The knights who abused Syanna did so behind a knight's image, using her condition as an excuse to be overly cruel, and the populace as a whole has allowed these ideals to condition them to live in their own little bubble. But perhaps the most tragic case of this theme is that of Detlef, the man who is forced partly by his love and compassion into doing terrible deeds that go against his very nature. Despite being a hurt, awkward, and withdrawn sort of man, And despite being, quite frankly, a monster on the outside, Syanna was the only person at the time to accept him for who he was and treat him with respect. Likely due to how she had grown to know the horrors of being shunned for things out of one's control. Detlef fell in love, and he committed these murders to save the person who turned his life around. But it brought him great, terrible pain to become this cruel, because that was not the type of person he was.
He's killed one night since I got here, at least 3 others before I arrived.
For good reason, I'm sure. Understand, Detlef is not some decadent shit who kills for sport, or to assuage a dryness of throat or a dullness of mood.
Seem pretty damn sure of that.
I am, because I know him very well. Despite appearances to the contrary, you two are quite alike. You've both noble hearts, yet you both are wont to perform ignoble deeds. When circumstances force you to, of course.
In grief and rage at himself, in unparalleled remorse, he cuts off the hand that committed the murder. And this, more than anything, shows how reluctant Detlef was to take part in this, and that he was not a bad person deep down. And he essentially says as much to Geralt between the lines, when the two come face to face at the awkward banquet.
Master Witcher, maybe you could satisfy my curiosity. What's it like going toe-to-toe with a monster, knowing you've only 2 options, to kill or be killed?
Despite what you might have heard, I don't lunge at every monster I see sword in hand. Talking gets the job done for some.
I wonder what a monster might have to say to you.
It might want to apologize.
My word. What might a monster wish to apologize to a witcher?
For killing. Though at times there is no choice, when loved ones are at risk and require protection.
Same as humans. Put them in that situation, they'll kill too.
You understand this. It must be why you and Regis are friends. If I understand you correctly, you would rather help a monster than kill it.
If possible, yeah. Or at least try.
Yet, circumstances change and force us into doing things that may have seemed unimaginable, and it can be a tragic thing. Should he have been stronger-willed and refused the blackmail? Maybe, but from his perspective, the life of someone good and precious was in the balance, and it's hard to detach oneself from the concept of personal bias in evaluating his decision. As it does with so many other characters and situations that I've described, Blood and Wine does not moralize or encourage you to think any certain way about Detlef. It simply lays out the facts and shows his point of view. He didn't intend to murder, but he did murder. And the degree of blame that lays with him is dependent on your own personal philosophy. But the point is that as much as Detlef was a villain, a part of him was a victim. He was a gentle soul, and when questioning who is at blame for all of this, one finds themselves going in a circle. Detlef murdered, but Syanna was the mastermind behind it, yet the abuse of her childhood taught her to become this way. One could argue that the knights errants from back then, and those who shunned Syanna, were the seed of all of this, but in the end I feel like Blood and Wine is trying to tell us that the blame lies with everyone, and no one.
I'm here.
This belonged to you, maybe?
It did, but you may keep it. I've a new one. I do not know you. I've done you no harm. Yet first you butchered a Bruxer who was dear to me. Now you pursue me. Why?
You've killed 4 innocent people, at least.
And you? How many innocents have you cut down?
As I said, I think the main message of Blood and Wine is a display of this perspectivism. That close-mindedness can lead to a self-harming sort of naivete as it did for Toussaint, but more importantly, that in some situations, there is no villain even in the worst of contexts, and moralizing is a redundant and futile exercise. These people were all given bad hands in life, and reacted in various ways. From the good in someone like Regis's case, to the bad in someone like Syanna's case, and everything in between. For this very reason, I consider Detlef in particular to be an antagonist, but not a real villain, despite being the final boss. He's extremely sympathetic and well-written, and he did do terrible things, but I put him in the Bloody Baron / Olgierd camp as a character of nuance and moral ambiguity, rather than in the Wild Hunt / Gaunter Odim / Crone's camp of pure destruction or malice. But he definitely stands out for how appropriately he fits thematically, and for how sad his story was.
This Detlef, an intriguing man to say the least.
Don't know him too well. He say much about himself?
Not much, but I've a good sense of the true nature of those I meet. I'd not survive a week at court otherwise.
So what's his?
Sensitive, sad. He carries within him the weight of a terrible tragedy. He is a good man, but lost, which is why he comes across as grim.
In a story full of so many victims, it's hard to envision an ending that works out perfectly for everyone. That's why even in the happiest one, where Syanna and Henrietta make up and the kingdom recovers, Detlef perishes. There simply is no way to save the man, and no way for a totally happy conclusion for such a bloody and tragic tale. The same is obviously true in the bad ending, where Detlef kills Syanna, Geralt is sent to prison by an irate Henrietta, and must be sprung from jail, which is admittedly a pretty unfulfilling one for me. As a side note, I personally think that the most powerful of the three endings is the tragic one. Not just because I'm an edgelord, but because I thought it fit the story best thematically. In this one, Henrietta forgives Syanna's crimes and welcomes her into her arms for an embrace. And Syanna uses this as an opportunity to kill the sister that forgot about her during her trials. Syanna succeeds and is killed immediately afterwards, and the two sisters' lives end as they began, with each other. Syanna, a victim of neglect and abuse, and Henrietta, a victim of hopeless, optimistic, narrow-minded idealism. It was a completely foolish thing for the Duchess to do, but her heart was too big, and her vision too clouded by memories and the emphasis on blood connections, just as her kingdom is. Some things just can't be forgiven. It is depressing, and Toussaint mourns for its Duchess, but this is the most powerful and appropriate story beat in the game for me in terms of nailing the impact of this theme of naivete. I do enjoy the good ending, and can't really argue that it isn't more fulfilling or equally as powerful technically for the heartwarming way in which Henrietta realizes her mistakes and the two come to an understanding, but this one just hits home a little bit more for me, and carries out the themes with a bit more continuity. In my opinion, this style of narrative is optimized when the Greek tragedy of the plot is carried out in full force, to truly show the pointlessness of these conflicts and the simple value of empathy and compassion, both of which could have saved multiple characters throughout the story if only they had the chance. And as an extension of this perspectivism, we finally see an end to Geralt's story that we know he deserves. Geralt is a witcher through and through. He's reviled as a savage and a freak at times, and he isn't the most diplomatic of personalities, but our journey with him proves that he is ultimately a genuinely good, honest person. We've been through everything with him, seen the things he's seen, felt what he's felt. His perspective is ours, and due to this, there is a hugely gratifying feeling in seeing Geralt find a home in the happy ending of this expansion. Through politics and intrigue, bloodshed and agony, pain and trials and grief, if anyone in this story deserved this sort of thing, it would without doubt be the White Wolf. Many thanks for watching.
I believe we deserve a bit of a rest.
That we do.